Don't worry, she won't understand a word anyway. The sentence landed lightly, almost playful, but the laughter that followed was sharp enough to cut through crystal and conversation alike, and for a brief second, even the pianist in the corner seemed to hesitate before continuing the soft jazz that filled the room. The rooftop restaurant hovered 40 floors above downtown Chicago, glass walls framing a skyline built on ambition, money, and the quiet belief that power belonged to those who spoke the loudest. And at the center of it all sat Ethan Caldwell, a man worth more than most companies in the Midwest, leaning back in his chair with the ease of someone who had never been told no. Around him, investors nodded, partners smiled too quickly, and servers moved like shadows trained not to interrupt the illusion of control. And among them was Naomi Brooks, her posture straight, her steps measured, her expression calm in the way that only comes from learning early that reactions are a luxury not everyone can afford. She approached the table with a tray balanced in one hand, the other steady as she refilled a glass without spilling a drop, her eyes briefly scanning the room not for approval but for patterns, for tone, for the small shifts in energy that most people missed when they were too busy being important. Ethan didn't look at her when he spoke again, his voice just loud enough to carry, just soft enough to pretend it wasn't meant to humiliate. I could probably close this deal faster talking to a wall, he said, swirling the bourbon in his glass as a few men chuckled, not because it was funny but because laughter in rooms like this was currency. Naomi didn't respond, not because she didn't hear, but because she heard everything, the tone, the assumption, the quiet dismissal wrapped in polished words, and as she stepped back, her reflection briefly caught in the glass behind him. There was something in her eyes that didn't match the role she was playing. Just for a moment the camera of someone's phone shifted, capturing a flash of her face, then cutting quickly to Ethan mid-laugh, then to the table, then away again as if the person filming wasn't sure why they had started recording in the first place. Across the room, a large screen displayed a single number in bold white text, $500 million, the value of the deal Ethan was about to secure, the reason every person at that table was willing to overlook what they would never tolerate anywhere else. And yet, beneath the surface something subtle had already begun to shift, something quiet and precise like the moment before a chess piece is moved. Naomi adjusted the edge of a napkin, her fingers steady, her breathing even, and somewhere deep in the rhythm of the night, between the clink of glasses and the low hum of ambition, the story had already started to change, not with a shout, not with a scene, but with a silence that was about to mean something very different. Naomi stepped away from the table, but not far, just enough to become invisible again. Just another figure in a pressed uniform moving between power and pretense. Yet her mind was not in the room the way the others were. It was sharper, quieter, cataloging every word, every number, every careless assumption that floated too easily across polished wood and expensive glass. And as she passed the service station, she paused for half a second, just long enough to glance at the tablet screen left open by a junior associate who had been too eager to impress and not careful enough to protect what mattered, columns of projections, timelines, and one detail that did not belong, a figure slightly off, small enough to be ignored by most, but not by someone trained to notice what others dismissed. Earlier that evening, before the city lights had fully taken over the sky, Naomi had stood in a narrow kitchen hallway scrolling through a message on her phone, her younger brother's name at the top, the words simple but heavy. They said the medication is due tomorrow, and she had typed back a single line, I will take care of it, not because she was certain how, but because certainty was not something she had ever been given, only responsibility, and responsibility had taught her how to see patterns, how to learn quickly, how to listen when people thought she could not understand. Back in the dining room, Ethan's voice rose again, confident, controlled, the voice of a man who had rehearsed success so many times it felt like instinct. We are looking at a clean close within 90 days, he said, tapping the table lightly as if the deal itself were already signed, and the investors leaned in, drawn not just to the numbers but to the certainty behind them, because certainty, even when it is misplaced, is persuasive. Naomi returned with a fresh bottle, her movements precise, her expression unchanged, and as she poured, she heard it again, the same number, repeated with the same confidence, the same quiet flaw hidden beneath it. And this time, she did not look at the table, she looked at the screen behind them, at the large white digits that promised $500 million, and for a brief moment, something shifted in her posture, not outwardly, not enough for anyone to call attention to it, but internally, like a decision forming. Across the table, one of the younger investors frowned slightly, not fully understanding why, just sensing that something in the rhythm of the conversation felt off, like a note slightly out of tune. But before he could speak, Ethan continued, filling the silence before it could become a question, because control for him was not just about answers, it was about timing. Naomi stepped back again, her hands now empty, her role once more reduced to presence without voice. Yet her eyes remained on the details no one else seemed to notice, and in that quiet space between service and silence, the gap between what was being said and what was actually true began to widen, just enough that, if someone chose to step into it, everything in the room would change. The room did not notice the shift, not yet, because power has a way of blinding those who believe they already own the outcome, and Ethan Caldwell leaned forward slightly, his fingers steepled, his tone steady, confident, rehearsed to perfection. "The margin scale cleanly after the second quarter," he said, his voice carrying just enough authority to quiet the last whisper of doubt, and around him, heads nodded again, not because they had verified every detail, but because confidence often replaces verification when the stakes are high and the speaker sounds certain. Naomi stood just beyond the edge of the table, close enough to hear everything, far enough to remain unseen, and as the numbers continued to flow, she felt it again, that quiet misalignment, not loud, not obvious but persistent, like a thread pulled slightly out of place in an otherwise perfect fabric. Her eyes moved once more to the screen, to the projection that everyone admired but no one questioned, and then back to the tablet she had glimpsed earlier, the inconsistency now clearer in her mind, not just a number, but a chain reaction waiting to happen. A single flawed assumption that would ripple through every promise being made in that room. One of the senior investors shifted in his seat, his brow tightening for just a second. "Can you walk us through the cost adjustments again?" he asked, his tone polite but edged with something sharper, something closer to caution, and for the first time that evening Ethan paused, not long enough to lose control, but long enough to recalibrate, to choose his next words carefully, because questions, even small ones, had a way of multiplying if not handled quickly. Naomi watched the exchange without moving, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her breathing steady, but inside something was building, not anger, not fear but clarity, the kind that comes when all the pieces finally connect and the truth becomes too precise to ignore. She thought again of the message on her phone, of the quiet promise she had made, and then back to the numbers, to the flaw that no one else seemed willing to name, and in that moment, the distance between her world and theirs felt both vast and fragile, separated not by intelligence or ability, but by who was allowed to speak and who was expected to stay silent. Ethan continued, his explanation smooth, controlled, filling in the gaps just enough to move forward, and the room began to settle again, the brief tension dissolving into agreement, into the familiar rhythm of a deal closing, signatures implied before ink ever touched paper. But Naomi did not move away this time, she remained where she was, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, yet there was something different now, something subtle but undeniable, like the air just before a storm shifts in pressure, and as she looked at the table, at the men who believed they understood everything happening in front of them, she realized that the truth was no longer something she could simply observe, because once you see it clearly enough, silence stops being neutral, and the next moment, the one that would change everything, was already beginning to take shape. The silence did not break. All at once it shifted slowly like something fragile being tested from the inside, and Naomi took a single step forward, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate enough to exist in a space where she was never meant to exist, and for the first time that night, the movement itself drew attention, subtle at first, a glance from the junior associate, a pause from the investor who had asked the earlier question, and then Ethan noticed too, not fully turning, not yet, but enough to register that something in his perfectly controlled environment had changed. Naomi's voice when it came was not loud, it did not demand attention, it simply carried, clear and steady. "Excuse me," she said, and the word alone was enough to ripple across the table because it was not expected, not from her, not in this room, not in this moment, and for a fraction of a second no one responded, as if the system itself needed time to process that the wrong person had spoken. Ethan turned then slowly, his expression composed but edged with irritation, the kind that hides behind professionalism. "Yes?" he asked, the single syllable tight, controlled, already prepared to dismiss whatever came next. Naomi did not look away, her posture unchanged, her hands relaxed at her sides. "The cost adjustment you mentioned," she continued, her tone even, "it does not account for the second phase logistics shift after 60 days. And the words landed differently than anything else that had been said that night, not because they were louder, but because they were precise, and precision in a room built on confidence has a way of cutting deeper than volume. There was a pause, longer this time, not polite, not comfortable, a real pause, the kind that forces people to think instead of react, and one of the investors leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing not at Naomi but at Ethan. Ethan's smile returned quickly, practiced, controlled. "I think there might be some confusion," he said, his voice smooth again, reclaiming the rhythm. "We have already accounted for that internally," and a few heads nodded, relieved to return to familiarity, to trust the script they expected to follow. But Naomi did not step back. She did not apologize. She did not retreat into invisibility. Instead, she took another small step, just enough to remain present. "The projection assumes a fixed supplier rate," she said, still calm, still steady. "But the contract you are referencing expires in 45 days, not 90. And this time the reaction was immediate, not loud but visible. The investor who had been nodding stopped, his expression tightening. Another reached for the tablet, scrolling quickly, searching for confirmation that should have been obvious if it were correct. Ethan's fingers tapped once against the table, a small movement but sharper now. "We have contingency options," he replied, the confidence still there but thinner, stretched across a moment that no longer felt fully under his control, and Naomi held his gaze, not challenging, not aggressive, simply present. "Those options increase operational costs by at least 12%, she said, and then, just for a moment, the room lost its balance, not physically but socially, the hierarchy bending under the weight of something no one had planned for. No one laughed this time, no one looked away, and somewhere in the background the music continued, soft and steady, but it no longer filled the space the same way, because now there was something else in the air, something sharper, something undeniable, the beginning of a truth that was no longer willing to stay quiet. No one spoke immediately because the room was no longer operating on habit, it was recalculating, and that kind of silence feels different, heavier, more honest, and the investor closest to the screen reached forward, his fingers moving faster now, pulling up documents, cross-checking numbers that had moments ago felt unquestionable, while another leaned back, his expression no longer impressed but alert, the way people look when they realize they might have missed something important hiding in plain sight. Ethan exhaled slowly, controlled, measured, the kind of breath that buys time, and then he smiled again, but this time the smile did not reach his eyes. "We appreciate the attention to detail," he said, his tone smooth, almost gracious, but there was a tightness underneath it, something sharper, something defensive. "However, those projections are based on internal models that are not publicly available," and a few heads nodded, not fully convinced, but not ready to challenge him either. Because authority, even when it cracks, still carries weight. Naomi did not move, did not shrink, did not soften her presence to make the moment easier. Instead she spoke again, just as calmly. "The model references the same supplier agreement filed in last quarter's disclosure," she said, and now the words did more than interrupt. They connected, they pointed, they revealed, and the investor with the tablet stopped scrolling, his eyes narrowing as recognition replaced doubt. "Page 42, Naomi added, her voice still even, still controlled, and that was the moment the room shifted completely, not in volume, but in alignment, attention moving away from Ethan and toward her, not because of who she was but because of what she knew. Someone at the far end of the table leaned forward. "Is that accurate?" he asked, not to Naomi but to Ethan, and the question itself carried weight, because it meant the authority in the room had just been redistributed, even if only slightly. Ethan's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second, almost invisible but enough, and he reached for his glass, buying another moment, another breath. "There are variables you are not accounting for," he replied, but the certainty was thinner now, stretched across a situation he no longer fully controlled. Naomi's gaze did not waver. "The variable you are referring to increases cost, not reduces it," she said, and there was no edge in her voice, no accusation, just clarity, the kind that does not need force to be felt. The investor who had been quiet until now closed his tablet slowly, not out of dismissal but decision, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, deliberate. "We need to revisit the numbers before moving forward." And just like that, the rhythm of the evening broke, not dramatically, not loudly but definitively, like a deal slipping out of alignment, one detail at a time. Around the table, expressions shifted, confidence replaced by caution, certainty replaced by questions, and in the middle of it all stood Naomi, still in the same uniform, still holding nothing in her hands, yet no longer invisible, because in a room built on power, the moment truth becomes undeniable, it does not matter who speaks it, only that it cannot be ignored. The shift was no longer subtle, it was structural, the kind that rearranges a room without anyone physically moving, and Ethan felt it before he fully understood it, the way conversations no longer leaned toward him, the way eyes moved past him and returned to Naomi, not with disbelief anymore, but with focus, and focus is dangerous. When it is no longer yours to control. He set his glass down carefully, the sound soft but deliberate, reclaiming space the only way he knew how, through presence, through composure, through the expectation that authority, once established, does not simply disappear. Let us not overcomplicate this, he said, his tone firm now, less polished, more direct. Large-scale deals always involve fluid variables, and for a moment it almost worked, a few nods, a few shoulders easing, because certainty, even when weakened, still offers comfort to those who want the deal to go through. But Naomi did not step back into that comfort. She remained exactly where she was, her voice steady, her gaze level. Fluid variables do not erase fixed deadlines, she replied, and the sentence did not rise, it did not push, it simply landed, and that was enough. The investor who had first questioned the numbers leaned forward again, this time no hesitation in his posture. Where did you learn to read these filings? He asked, and the question shifted the frame entirely, because it was no longer about whether she was right, it was about who she was, and Naomi answered without pause. From the same public records your team uses, she said, and there was no pride in it, no performance, just fact, clean and unadorned. Another voice joined, quieter but sharper, then why did no one else flag this? And this time no one answered immediately, because the answer was not technical, it was cultural, it was about assumptions, about who is expected to speak and who is expected to stay silent, and in that silence the weight of the moment grew heavier. Ethan's jaw tightened again, more visible now, the composure still there but working harder. We have an entire analytics division reviewing these projections, he said, the emphasis clear, the implication sharper, and for a second the room held on to that, the idea that systems are more reliable than individuals, that structure protects against oversight. Naomi's response came just as calmly. Then they used the wrong baseline, she said, and this time there was no immediate recovery, no smooth transition, just a pause that stretched long enough for everyone to feel it. The investor with the tablet turned it slightly toward the others, the numbers now visible, highlighted, compared, undeniable in a way that no explanation could easily dismiss, and, one by one, the expressions around the table shifted again, not dramatically, but decisively, from confidence to reconsideration, from momentum to pause. The screen behind them still displayed the same number, $500 million, unchanged, bright, certain, but now it felt different, less like a promise and more like a question. Naomi remained still, her role unchanged in appearance, still the waitress in a quiet uniform, yet the center of gravity in the room had moved, not because she demanded it, but because she revealed something that could not be ignored. And in a space built on power, that kind of truth does not just interrupt the moment, it begins to rewrite it. The room did not return to normal because something fundamental had already been exposed, and once a flaw is seen clearly, it does not disappear just because someone tries to move past it. And Ethan Caldwell understood that now, not in theory but in real time, as the weight of the conversation shifted away from him in a way he had never allowed before. He leaned back slightly, not in relaxation but in recalibration, his eyes studying Naomi with a focus that had not been there earlier, no longer dismissive, no longer amused, but measuring, calculating, trying to understand how a presence he had ignored minutes ago had become the most precise voice in the room. You are making assumptions based on incomplete context, he said, his tone controlled, but the edge was clearer now, sharper, less concealed, and the words were not just a response, they were an attempt to regain structure, to reestablish hierarchy, to remind everyone who was supposed to lead. Naomi did not react to the tone, she did not mirror it, she did not step into conflict, she simply answered, then clarify the context. And the simplicity of the sentence landed harder than any argument, because it did not challenge him emotionally, it challenged him factually, and facts require substance, not authority. The investor at the far end of the table nodded slowly. Yes, clarify, he echoed, and now the pressure was no longer on Naomi to prove herself, it was on Ethan to support what he had already claimed. For a brief moment the rhythm broke again, not dramatically but enough, and Ethan's fingers tapped once more against the table, a habit now, subtle but telling, as he reached for an explanation that would hold under scrutiny, not just presentation. The supplier extension is already in negotiation, he said, his voice steady again, reclaiming some ground. We expect confirmation before the current term expires, And a few heads turned toward each other, considering weighing because expectation is not certainty, but it can still carry influence if presented correctly. Naomi listened, her posture unchanged, her presence still calm, and then she spoke. "There is no filed amendment or preliminary notice," she said. And now the distinction was clear: expectation versus documentation, assumption versus record, and the gap between them widened in a way that could no longer be softened by tone. One of the investors leaned forward, his voice lower now, more deliberate. "If that extension does not come through, what happens to the margin?" And the question was not casual, it was structural. It cut to the foundation of the entire deal, and this time the room did not look to Ethan with automatic confidence, it waited. Ethan inhaled slowly, his composure still intact but working harder. "We adjust," he said, but the word felt smaller now, less definitive, and the silence that followed was no longer neutral, it was evaluative. Naomi's voice came again, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. "The adjustment removes profitability in the second quarter," she said. And that was the moment everything aligned, not emotionally, but logically, the numbers, the timeline, the risk, all converging into a single realization that no one in the room could comfortably ignore. The investor with the tablet set it down, not out of dismissal but decision, and another leaned back, exhaling slowly, the kind of breath that signals a shift from pursuit to reconsideration. And through it all, Naomi remained exactly where she was, not elevated by position, not changed by recognition, but undeniable in presence, because the truth she had introduced was no longer a detail, it was the center. And in a room built on control, that kind of shift does not just interrupt power, it redefines who holds it. No one reached for their glass anymore, no one checked their phone, no one pretended this was still just another dinner, because the illusion had already cracked, and what replaced it was something far less comfortable, something real, and Ethan Caldwell felt it in the way the room no longer moved with him but around him, the way attention no longer followed his voice but waited, measured, compared. He straightened slightly, his posture still composed, still controlled, but there was a weight to it now, a resistance, like someone holding position on ground that was slowly giving way beneath them. "We are discussing projections," he said, his tone firmer now, less polished, more defensive, "not guarantees." And the statement was technically correct, carefully chosen, but it did not restore what had been lost, because the room had already moved past surface language and into substance. The investor who had remained silent the longest finally spoke, his voice calm but decisive. "Projections require reliable assumptions," he said, and he did not look at Naomi when he spoke. He looked directly at Ethan, and that shift, that alignment, was impossible to ignore. Naomi stood where she was, her presence unchanged, her expression steady, but her silence now carried weight. Not absence, not background, but presence, the kind that does not need to repeat itself to be understood. Across the table, another investor closed his folder slowly, the sound soft but final, and leaned back in his chair, his decision already forming before he spoke it. "We cannot move forward tonight," he said, and the words did not explode, they settled, heavy and clear, the kind of statement that does not need emphasis because its meaning is already complete. A subtle shift moved through the room, not chaos, not panic, but recalibration. People adjusting not just their expectations, but their positions, their strategies, their understanding of what had just happened. Ethan did not respond immediately this time, and that was new, that pause, that absence of immediate control, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, still controlled but no longer dominant. "We can revisit the numbers," he said, but the offer felt different now, not like leadership but like recovery. Naomi's gaze moved briefly to the screen behind them, the numbers still glowing, still unchanged, but now disconnected from reality, and then back to the table, where the real decisions were being made, quietly, deliberately, without spectacle. One of the junior associates shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Ethan and Naomi, as if trying to understand how something so small, so unexpected, had altered something so large, and the answer was not in volume or authority, it was in clarity, in the willingness to say what others overlooked. The music in the background continued, soft and steady, but it no longer defined the atmosphere. It filled space that had already been redefined by something stronger. Naomi adjusted her stance slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply existing in the moment she had helped create. And for the first time that night, no one saw her as part of the service, no one saw her as background, because once truth becomes visible, it changes the way everything else is seen, and in that quiet, undeniable shift, the power in the room had already changed hands. The meeting did not end with a handshake, it ended with a shift, quiet but irreversible, the kind that does not echo loudly in the moment but lingers long after the room empties, and one by one chairs moved back, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to signal that something had changed, that the momentum that once pulled everyone forward had come to a complete stop. The investors gathered their materials slowly, no urgency, no excitement, just calculation, reassessment, and a distance that had not been there before, and as they stood, a few glanced at Naomi, not out of curiosity anymore but recognition, the kind that comes when someone has altered the outcome without ever raising their voice. Ethan Caldwell remained seated for a moment longer than the others, his posture still composed, but the stillness now carried a different meaning, not control but reflection, and when he finally stood, the room did not adjust around him the way it had earlier. It simply continued, independent, unaffected, as if the center had moved and he was no longer standing in it. Naomi stepped back then, not because she was dismissed, but because her part in the moment was complete, her hands returning to the quiet rhythm of her role, adjusting a glass, aligning a napkin, movements as precise as before, yet nothing about her presence felt the same, not to the room, not to those who had just watched what happened. One of the senior investors paused near her, just briefly, his voice low but sincere. "Thank you," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried weight, acknowledgement not of position but of clarity, and Naomi nodded once, not seeking more, not holding on to the moment, just accepting it as it was. Across the room the large screen still displayed the same number, bright and confident, but now it felt hollow, disconnected from the decisions that had just been made. And without ceremony, one of the assistants reached up and turned it off, the light fading, the promise disappearing with it. Ethan walked past Naomi on his way out, his steps measured, his expression controlled, but for a brief second he slowed, not enough to stop, not enough to speak, just enough to look, really look. And in that glance there was something new, not dominance, not dismissal but awareness, the kind that comes too late to change what has already happened. Naomi did not react, she did not meet the moment with anything more than stillness, because she did not need to, the shift had already occurred, the outcome already written. Outside, the city continued as it always did, lights stretching across the skyline, traffic moving in steady lines, unaware of the quiet reversal that had taken place high above it, and inside, as the last of the guests disappeared and the room returned to its original calm, one thing remained clear, not spoken, not announced but understood, that power built on assumption can disappear in a moment, but truth, once spoken, does not need permission to be heard. And that night, without raising her voice, without stepping out of her role, Naomi Brooks had changed everything.